Welcome to your Health and Inequality class. Today we're going to talk about cultures of risk, epigenetics, and the politics of exposure. These are the required readings for today. This is the overview for today. First, we're going to talk about toxic exposure and cultures of risk. We're going to discuss the concept of risk society and precautionary consumption. We're going to talk about biomedicalization, and we're going to talk about exposure and stratified risk. In the second half of this lecture, we're going to talk about environmental epigenetics. Okay, so let's start talking about cultures of risk and the politics of exposure. Ulrich Beck is a German sociologist who proposed the concept of risk society. He argues that in late modernity, societies are bounded by the logic of risk or the anticipation of techno-scientifically produced risk and disasters. Risk provides a mechanism to probabilistically codify how hazards and insecurities are governed. And in these societies, in Western societies, he says that instead of looking at the structural causes that lead to disasters and risk, we are always putting the blame on consumers. And so we are constantly appealing to responsible consumers. Examples of these human-made disasters are, for instance, the Chernobyl nuclear accident of 1986 and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster of 2011. And so along with these human-made disasters, we have this narrative that responsibilizes consumers for their actions, right, for being exposed. We also have companies that cast doubt over the negative effects of the products they produce on health. Here you can think of the tobacco industry, for instance. Throughout the 90s, the tobacco industry tried to deny or cast doubt over health research that showed that tobacco is bad for people's health. And tobacco, of course, is just one example. There are many other industries, polluting industries, that follow the same pattern. These companies cast doubt over results showing that their products have health effects. And they do so their products can continue to circulate and generate profits. Instead of regulating these industries, these companies create incentive for individuals to keep buying products that are supposed to help you reduce your risk of exposure without having really proved that this will benefit your health. So an example of these are endocrine disruptors. So these are chemicals that might interfere with the body's endocrine system and produce adverse developmental, reproductive, neurological, and immune effects in both humans and wildlife. There's here a wide range of substances are included, both natural and man-made. And these substances are thought to cause endocrine disruption, including pharmaceuticals, dioxin and diosine-like compounds, polychlorinating biphenyls, DDT, and other pesticides, and plasticizers such as bisphenol A. These endocrine disruptors might be found in everyday products, including plastic bottles, metal food cans, detergents, flame retardants, food, toys, cosmetics, and pesticides. And so sometimes consumers are encouraged to buy maybe organic or fill-the-blank labels that rise, for instance, the cost of food and products without actually showing that they reduce your exposure to these toxics. Okay, and so now moving from this idea of risk society, we can talk about biomedicalization. 2 weeks ago, we talked about medicalization, the process by which human conditions and problems come to be defined and treated as medical conditions and thus become the subject of medical study, diagnosis, prevention, or treatment. We talk about how medicalization encourages people to treat all kinds of disease through drug treatments, right? And how this benefits pharmaceutical companies. And how pharmaceutical companies have allowed to say and have a lot of power in defining the health research agenda, right? And so this idea of biomedicalization builds upon medicalization, of course, as you can tell because of their name. But biomedicalization is about surveillance medicine at the level of risk and risk factors. This is not just about disease. And so, here you have to think of this idea that today in society, there is this narrative that everybody is, in a way, potentially ill. And the article that we read about breast cancer risk as disease by Foskett from 2010 is a good example of this, because there she talks about chemo prevention as an example of biomedicalization. And so in the case of chemo prevention, breast cancer prevention is conceptualized as the treatment of breast cancer risk with pharmaceuticals rather than the identification and elimination of cancer-causing agents. So again, with biomedicalization, what you need to keep in mind is this idea that it's not just about defining a condition as a medical condition. With biomedicalization, it's about targeting risk, health risk, and approaching them as a treatable health problem. And so in the case of chemo prevention, it's very interesting that despite the many controversies around the breast cancer prevention trials, the FDA approved tamoxifen for the reduction of risk of breast cancer incidence. And so you can see here how the curative model of health is now being applied to risk and prevention. As Foskett notes, since we are already accustomed to treating symptoms of individuals with techno-scientific products like pharmaceuticals, the idea of treating risk the same way is a logical extension of normative biomedicalized ideology and practice. Well, and in this case, there's also the irony, right, that this component, tamoxifen, can cause cancer if it is applied in other parts of the body, right? And so it's kind of ironic that despite that, it was still approved as a treatment for preventing breast cancer in women. And so in the same way that diseases are unequally distributed, as you can imagine, risks are unequally distributed in a risk society. They're unequally distributed across class, race, gender, and geographic location or occupation. So for instance, if we think just about race and class, Dorcita Taylor, who is an environmental sociologist, has done very important research showing that industrial sites and Superfund sites are located disproportionately in low-income areas and communities of colors. Examples of these are, for instance, asthma in the South Bronx, the Cancer Alley in LA, lead poisoning in Flint, and many other areas in the US. For example, we find high rates of asthma in the South Bronx, which are twice as high as the rest of New York City. And these are closely entangled with exposure to rodents, bugs, broken plaster, peeling paint, water leaks, and diesel exhaust. The case of Cancer Alley in Louisiana is another example. Okay, so in this second part of the lecture, we're going to talk about environmental epigenetics. So Julie Goodman and Becky Mansfield talk about this in the article that I assigned for this lecture, Epigenetic Life, Biological Plasticity, Abnormality, and New Configurations of Race and Reproduction. And so in a society where there is growing concern around environmental risk and how risk affect our health outcomes, it makes sense that epigenetic is an emerging and popular technology. So you probably have heard about epigenetic enhancement outside of this class. But what Mansfield and Goodman are trying to argue here is that epigenetics is a technology that tries to improve or optimize life, right? It aims to do so through biomedical and behavioral interventions to eliminate the effective biological differences to fix the individual, and so that defects cannot be passed on into the future to the next generation. And so there are four main points that they make about epigenetics. First is that with this technology, you have the possibility of improvement. And with that, it comes the responsibility of individuals to invite and accept these interventions as they become available. And so she says, quote unquote, the environment might be creating epigenetic shift, but it's an individual responsibility to change one's exposure to the environment. So according to these authors, epigenetics creates new racialized pressures. If epigenetics is about how racism and disadvantage get under their skin, it normalizes white bodies and behaviors and reinforces the idea that people of color need to emulate the environments and behaviors of rich people in order to protect themselves and their offspring. Epigenetics, according to Mansfield and Goodman, also expands the category of racialized difference. According to them, the epigenetic model of intervention or optimization needs a determination of what is normal or abnormal. So epigenetics, in a way, is changing what is normal. Normal is not the average anymore. Normal becomes the optimal. Mansfield and Goodman also note that epigenetic variation operates through an eugenic logic, which is something that we were talking about, what is eugenics, in one of the discussions in the forum. So epigenetics, in a way, tries to eliminate undesirable, broad and deep biological differences in the name of the optimal life. Differences end up being pathologized as diseases that need to be cured. And so life improvement is not only targeted at the individual level, but also at the population level. And so that's why it has this eugenic logic attached to it. And finally, Mansfield and Goodman also argue that the main target of epigenetic intervention is the womb and women's behavior. Because there's this idea that intervention needs to happen the earliest as possible, in the earliest stages of life. And so women are held responsible for what they consume and the overall health of their babies. And this illustration figure about metabolic syndrome that comes from an article titled Epigenetic Programming by Maternal Nutrition Shaping Future Generations, which is referenced by Mansfield and Goodman, is in a way illustrates this idea that it's on women's responsibility to optimize their children's life since gestation. So in this article, for example, they say, quote unquote, fetal development archives past and present maternal environments, shaping phenotype across the life course and perhaps even across generation to that child's descendants. And so, as Mansfield and Goodman argue, gestation is not just about a time, a developmental window linking past, present, and future. It's also about a space, an environment that is supposed to be under women's control. And so this is why Mansfield and Goodman argue that epigenetics emerges as a reproductive science and technology in which women, especially women of color, become responsible for eliminating abnormal biological differences and optimizing good ones in the name of improving life itself. While the focus is the fetus, it is reproductive women who are reduced to intrauterine environments, who become the key actors in the epigenetic story of life. Okay, so I know that this lecture had a lot of topics and it was very complex, but these are the main takeaways that I want you to remember from this class. So first, remember that as a result of living in a risk society, we structure policy and science around risk. We're always trying to anticipate risk, and we're always trying to find ways to manage the future. And so now that intervention is targeting risk, not really diseases, this is what biomedicalization is all about. This opens up opportunities, more opportunities of profit making for the pharmaceutical industry and other industries, which at the same time continue to manufacture doubt over their impacts on our health and the environment. Another important feature of living in a risk society is that individuals are encouraged to reduce their exposure to toxins and chemicals via precautionary consumption, which, is this idea that you can prevent risk by buying green goods, for instance. And this is very concerning because we know that exposures are stratified by race, class, gender, and others, right? With minority groups often being impacted the most. So it is really worrisome that precautionary consumption and other ways to responsibilize consumers are being presented as solutions instead of looking at the structural problems of toxic environmental human-made disasters. And finally, we have this case of environmental epigenetics, which serves as a good example of how these ideas of optimizing life and reducing risk create new racialized pressures over minority groups. Okay, so that was it for today. I will encourage you to continue exploring this presentation. There's a PDF file on Sakai, and there I provide more information on this case of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and I also provide more examples regarding Superfund sites and e-waste.